سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا إنه هو السميع البصير.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. أما بعد, Jamaat al-Muslimin, respected viewers of Hilaal TV, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum jami'an aynama kuntum. Welcome to each and every single one of you, wherever you might be. This is our program, Palestine The Holy Land. And Palestine is in front of our eyes and our ears and our hearts every single day. We are seeing as the massacres unfold, as the genocide unfolds in the Gaza Strip. And what we've been doing over the last couple of days, we've been making a comparison, a very, very interesting comparison, comparing the Gaza ghetto, and I'm using the word ghetto for a specific reason. The Gaza ghetto compared to the Warsaw ghetto. The Gaza Arab ghetto, why? Because not just Muslims there, yes, majority Muslim, but there's also a Christian population living in Gaza. So let's say the Arab ghetto of Gaza versus the Jewish ghetto of Warsaw, Poland in the Second World War. And I have found so many parallels. Why? Because there is a battle of ideas out there in the media, in the social media, in the mainstream media. There's this battle of ideas. There are these accusations. There is name calling. So the Palestinians are calling the Zionists Nazis. And the Zionists are calling the Palestinian resistance Nazis. So now I want to see which one. We know who is committing the acts of the Nazis here. And I'm going to prove it. When you put the two together, when you juxtapose the Gaza ghetto, the Gaza Arab ghetto, next to the Warsaw Jewish ghetto, you will know exactly who is behaving like Nazis and who is committing the genocide. So without any further ado, I have prepared a clip for you, and this is from the YouTube channel called Yad Vashem, and this is a channel for Holocaust studies. This is a channel for Holocaust studies. And then inshallah ta'ala we can look at the similarities and discuss after that. So without any further ado, let us have the Yad Vashem clip on everyday life in the ghettos.
Shortly after receiving the order to relocate into the ghettos, the Jews were forced to quickly pack their entire lives into a number of suitcases and to set off into the unknown. They had to leave behind most of their property and could only take a small number of objects with them. The forced transition to the ghetto, carried out swiftly and irrevocably, is described in period diaries and testimonies as a humiliating, traumatic experience. The Jews were mostly concentrated in cities or towns, where they were intentionally housed in the poorest and most derelict neighborhoods. In some places, they were forced into a number of ghettos in the same city or town. The first ghetto was established in Piotrków Trybunalski as early as October 1939, about a month after the occupation of Poland. Most of the ghettos were established between 1940 and 1941, but the establishment of new ghettos continued until the middle of 1944. Some, such as the ghettos in Lodz and Warsaw, were closed ghettos surrounded by fences or a wall, with gates guarded by the German police or the local Polish police. The residents of these ghettos were not allowed to leave the ghetto area unless they were authorized to work outside under supervision. Other ghettos were open ghettos, from which it was possible to leave for work in the morning by showing the necessary permits and to return in the evening. Their relatively open nature meant that in cities and towns with open ghettos, there was a certain amount of contact between the Jews and the surrounding populations. The ghettos were intended to isolate the Jews hermetically, and the Germans furthered this goal by spreading propaganda among the non-Jewish population about the dangers of contact with Jews. The isolation was strictly enforced by the Germans, who ensured that Jews were cut off not only from their physical surroundings, but also from sources of news and information. The ghettos created subhuman living conditions that eroded all aspects of life of the Jewish population that was crowded into them. The ghetto was severely overpopulated. In most instances, the ghettos were erected in a small portion of the town, not at all suited for the numbers meant to live there. For example, the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the most densely populated ghettos, was established on only 2.4% of the city's total area, while housing Jews comprising roughly 1/3 of the city's population. The Jews in the ghettos were forced into small apartments. In some cases, several entire families who didn't know each other were forced into single apartments, with 6 to 8 people living in a single room. Extreme overcrowding, together with the poor sanitary conditions, led in many places to a massive death toll. The ghettos suffered from a severe lack of water and from deficient sewage systems. Large piles of trash filled the streets, and diseases such as tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery spread quickly. In addition, there was a constant lack of medication. The cold weather also influenced mortality, as the ghettos were barely provided with any heating material, so that many people died during the winter months from the extreme cold within the houses. Summers brought no respite, and were also characterized by high mortality rates, as the summer heat helped spread infectious diseases. In some ghettos, the residents established improvised healthcare systems that included hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, and disinfection devices. The lack of medical equipment and drugs forced the medical staff to be resourceful in finding solutions for difficult dilemmas. Since in most of the ghettos, the Jewish population was cut off from its surroundings and from sources of income, Jews were almost totally dependent on the daily food allotments provided by the German authorities. In each ghetto, the amount of food provided was different and depended on the authorities in charge. The food was distributed in accordance with racist Nazi policies, and as a result, one of the leading causes of mortality was a lack of nutrition. The Germans provided the ghetto's inhabitants with meager amounts of low-quality food as part of a policy of intentional starvation. The lack of food led to tensions between the ghetto residents, as theft of foodstuffs became widespread. At the same time, in some ghettos, food was smuggled in from the Aryan side, whereby the ghettos were able to continue existing. In Warsaw, for example, 80% of the ghetto's daily food supply was provided by smuggling. Smuggling was undertaken both by private people, adults as well as children, and by criminal organizations that were active in some of the ghettos. Children played an important part in smuggling activities, as they were able to fit through narrow passages. At times, the children were the only ones who could provide food for their family members. In some of the ghettos, Jews tried to sell the remainder of their property on the black market in order to purchase food, but these possibilities dwindled quickly. In the open ghettos, the conditions were slightly better, as the Jews in these ghettos still had contacts outside the ghetto. Many of them also worked outside the ghetto and were able to maintain relationships with the local population and obtain food. In the Lodz ghetto, on the other hand, which was completely cut off from its surroundings, starvation was widespread. the ghetto's residents subsisted on the minuscule food rations they were allotted, and only the workers in the factories were given occasional supplements. It is important to mention that all the ways in which additional food could be obtained, beyond what was allocated by the German authorities, were illegal and punishable by death. The nature of the work in the ghettos differed from one ghetto to another, depending on the policies of the local German occupying forces. In some ghettos, the Jewish leadership did what it could to create workplaces that would provide a source of income for the Jewish residents. Ghetto production was often undertaken with the thought that if the Germans or certain German authorities could turn a profit from the ghettos, they would come to be seen as necessary, and thereby the Jews living there would be saved. The thought that work could save lives was expressed, for example, in the workshops created in the Lodz ghetto, which supplied the military with essential equipment, in the Warsaw ghetto workshops that manufactured brushes and suitcases, and in the Vilna ghetto, which, under the leadership of the local Judenrat, became a production center, most of whose residents worked in workshops either within the ghetto or outside its confines. We can see that the lives of the ghettoized Jews were influenced by diverse factors and were bound up with a continual struggle for survival that was part of a cruel reality. The subhuman conditions created by the Germans in the ghettos were severely traumatizing for individuals and eroded the family and community structure. And yet, we can find many indications that the Jews in the ghettos sought to provide for more than just their basic physical existence, caring for intellectual, spiritual, and cultural needs, and trying to maintain a semblance of normal life through education, mutual assistance, underground newspapers, youth movements, and more.
And you can watch it on YouTube. It's called Everyday Life in the Ghettos by Yad Vashem, which basically educates people on the Holocaust. And I've actually, as I was sitting here, I was just making some notes of similarities. So the first point that he makes mention of is that people were moved to these ghettos. So exactly what happened in 1948. If you're talking about Gaza, then majority of the people in Gaza were displaced in 1948 from their Palestinian villages and from Palestinian towns, and they ended up as refugees in Gaza. We're only speaking about Gaza at the moment, not the West Bank. So in Gaza, for example, you have Al-Maghazi camp, Al-Shati camp, Al-Burayj camp, Dir Balah camp, Jabalia camp, and there are a few others as well. So these refugee camps are the refugee camps that were basically set up in 1948 to receive these refugees that were ethnically cleansed from Palestine. And they had their villages destroyed. Almost 500 villages were destroyed. And 750,000 to 1 million Palestinians were displaced. Now the same thing happened in the Second World War when the Nazis first invaded in 1939. They invaded Poland. And let's just speak about Poland for a moment here, because it wasn't just Poland that was invaded. Germany, in a very short space of time, under the system of the Blitzkrieg, basically took over most of Western Europe in the first year of the war, in a very short space of time. And what they did in Poland was, they gathered the Jews from all the shtetls and shtots. Shtetl, this is the Yiddish word for village, Jewish village, and shtot are the Jews that lived in the towns, in the cities. And they put them into ghettos. In fact, Poland had about 400 Jewish ghettos that the Jews were, after being displaced from their villages, from their homes, they were then moved. You saw the images of people moving with their horse and carts. I mean, you can see it now, 2024, and you see how the people are being displaced. They've got their carts, they've got their donkeys, and they've got all their possessions on the back of those carts. Just like the Jews were displaced in the Second World War. And then in Warsaw, which had the biggest population of any city in Europe, biggest Jewish population. In fact, the Jewish population was over 300,000, about 350,000, and they comprised a third of the population of Warsaw. And they, before the Nazi invasion of Poland, they basically lived with the Poles, in Poland. They traded with them. They lived in the same areas as them. There was no problem. But then what the Germans did was they forced the Jews to live in an area known as the Warsaw Ghetto, which basically comprised 2.4% of the size of the city of Warsaw, about 3.4 square kilometers. And the population of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto between 1940 1941 was basically went to the level of about 400,000. So it was the most densely populated area in Europe, if not the most, at least one of, but if not the most densely populated area or place in the whole of Europe. So that's the first comparison we can make, because Gaza, which is a very small strip of land, has a population of 2.3 million people, and it has been designated as the most densely populated strip of land in the whole world. So there's our first comparison. Or let's say the second comparison. The first comparison is the fact that the Jews that ended up in the Warsaw Ghetto were displaced from their homes, and they were moved to this ghetto. They were forcibly displaced from their homes and moved into the ghetto. The Palestinians in 48 were forcibly displaced from their villages, and they ended up in what we can also call, literally, in terms of making the comparison, they ended up in this Gaza ghetto. And the second comparison that we make is just like the Warsaw Ghetto was the most densely populated area in the whole of Europe, so Gaza is the most densely populated area in the world today. Number 3 is that these were closed ghettos. So they literally, they started building the wall. In fact, I think I mentioned there's a docudrama called The Wall about the Warsaw Ghetto. They started building the wall in October of 1940, and the whole Warsaw Jewish ghetto was sealed up by 1941. Exactly the same thing in Gaza. Gaza, we saw the fence that the resistance had to break through on the 7th of October. They'd literally been in a prison. Well, it is exactly what the Warsaw Ghetto was. It was like a prison. There was no freedom of movement. The Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto could not leave. They couldn't get out of the Warsaw Ghetto. They couldn't go anywhere without the permission of the German Nazi authorities. So that's our third similarity here, is that the Warsaw Jewish Ghetto was a closed ghetto. It was sealed off, had a huge wall built around it. Same story with Gaza. Gaza's been under a suffocating blockade since 2006, from the air, from the land, and from the sea. So closed ghettos and not allowed to leave. So we have a total of 4 similarities so far. Then number 4, in the Warsaw Ghetto, they could get, because now living in such conditions, the people were now ripe for exploitation. So the Nazis gave them permits to work outside the ghetto, but under their strict supervision. Same thing in Gaza. We saw that I don't know how many thousand people, Gazans, were working in the Zionist state of Israel, when the 7th of October happened, they were immediately arrested and tortured and abused. So another similarity, working outside with permits. Number 5 is propaganda. You know, the Nazis made this heinous propaganda against the Jews. You know, even telling the people living in the rest of Warsaw, well, Warsaw was basically divided into 3 when the Nazis came. It was divided into the Aryan section. Aryan, you must remember the Germans called themselves the Herrenvolk, you know, the master race. And they even looked down on the Polish people as subhuman, not just the Jews. The Poles were put into one section of the city, the Jews into another section of the city, and the Aryans, in inverted commas, the Germans, the Herrenvolk, the master race, in the other part of the city. And there was this continuous propaganda, you know, that the people shouldn't mix with the Jews. And this is something that's in the education system in the Zionist state. You know, speaking the worst things, you know, indoctrinating the Israelis to have the worst thoughts about the Palestinians and to literally look upon them as being subhuman, as we have seen the Minister of Defense calling them human animals. Wal-'iyadu billah. Then another similarity, I think we are on number 7 now. Cut off from news and information. The Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were cut off from all news and information. This is what the Israelis have been trying to do. They keep trying to cut the internet. Well, they've cut the electricity. No fuel, no electricity, in order that they can try and keep the information flow. They can restrict the information flow of what is coming out of and what's coming in, what's coming out, and also what's coming into Gaza. Number 8, according to this Holocaust YouTube channel, that the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto lived in subhuman conditions. They lived in subhuman conditions, basically meaning that the conditions that they lived in was not fit for human beings. And this is what's been happening since 2006 with the blockade, with the extremely high unemployment rate. The Palestinians in Gaza have been struggling just to survive, which is not something that an ordinary human being the type of conditions that they should be put to live in, where they have to literally struggle to survive each and every single day of their lives. Number 9, overcrowded. We've already spoken about being the most densely populated place in Europe at the time, the Warsaw Jewish Ghetto. Gaza, the most densely populated area in the world. 2.4% of the city of Warsaw, containing almost a third of its population. Small apartments, 6 to 8 people living in an apartment. Well, we've been seeing with the bombing of Gaza, 70% of the housing stock in Gaza destroyed. It's not just 6 to 8 people that have ended up in apartments. In actual fact, people moved into other people's apartments. At one stage, I think there was one Palestinian from Gaza outside was saying that there was over 100 people living in one apartment, because other people's apartments had been destroyed. And then even those apartments were destroyed, and they had to move into tents. Lack of water. This was a big problem in the Warsaw Jewish Ghetto. Lack of water, proper sewerage facilities, lack of medicine. These are all exactly what's happening in Gaza now. Cold, people died of the cold in the winter. It's winter now. There are, although Poland perhaps much colder than Gaza, still the people have got, it gets very cold. I've lived in the Middle East in winter time. It's a biting cold. And especially if people are suffering from malnutrition and healthy, they can easily die from exposure to the elements. spread of infectious diseases. But even under all of this, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were extremely resourceful. They set up their own workshops. They busied themselves. They tried to create a sort of normal semblance of life, through education. I mean, look at what the Gazans achieved under that blockade, setting up how many schools and universities and workshops, manufacturing the things with their own hands, that which they couldn't import from outside. And food allotments were strictly controlled by the Germans. Nothing goes in or out of Gaza except by the strict control of the Zionists. Number 19, malnutrition. We've spoken about that. Number 20, starvation policy. I mean, if you are cutting off water, fuel, food to a population of 2.3 million that are walled in, that's a starvation policy. Wal-'iyadu billah. Number 21, smuggling foods. They ended up having to smuggle foods through tunnels and narrow passages. The formation of resistance groups. We spoke about those 2 resistance groups yesterday. And how they created bunkers and tunnels in which they operated in the Jewish resistance in Warsaw. Handmade grenades and bombs. This is from the other documentary. The family and community erosion, and many more. But those 26 similarities are enough to prove who is behaving like Nazis and who is committing genocide. Until we meet again, inshallah ta'ala, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring an end to this genocide and grant freedom and liberation to the people of Palestine. Wa akhiru da'wana an alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا إنه هو السميع البصير.